Thank you. They deserve an applause, of course, yes. Thanks for being here, both of you. So I couldn't help but notice sometimes we need a frame to talk openly about stuff, but it is a frame anyway. So I'd like to bring some attention to the hyphenated artists, because tonight you're not here as artists alone, but as feminist artists, no? And I have some questions about that. At first, I'd like to hear your personal definition of feminism, because I've been here for some nights, and I will be for some nights still, and each one of my guests has a slightly different definition or a reason to differentiate in that. So I'd like to hear from you. Why is it? What is your definition first? Oh, come on, you're both so assertive on a stage right now, saying all kinds of important stuff. And
okay, I'm not asked this quite often, so yeah, it's good. I think my definition of feminism is a continuous battle/fight, but that has a negative connotation for the equal opportunities for women and men and all non-binary, non-gender conforming people on all levels, so social, economical, political levels. But if I gave it more thought, it would be more elaborate. This is my definition.
You use feminism, if I understand correctly, as an umbrella term for all kinds of equality. So it's your new word for equality. All right.
Yeah.
What about you, Mona?
I think I can relate really well to what you've just said. To me, feminism, I think at the lowest level is every struggle, work, connection, vision that is meant to irritate and unsettle the patriarchy. Mm-hmm. And that includes struggling for equality and same rights for everybody who's not cis male, basically. So actually, I've heard a good friend of mine give a talk just a couple of days ago, and she said that the term feminism might need a little bit of a thinking about, because within the patriarchy, yes, cis women suffer. But at the same time, we as cis women still have our certainty of the assigned gender, which people who are non-binary, non-conforming, inter or trans are not even afforded that. So, yeah, I think over the last 15 years, my own definition of feminism has broadened in that way a lot. And I think another aspect that's really important to me about feminism is on the one hand you have the struggle side, but on the other hand, to me it's really important to look at the vision side. So when I know what I struggle against, do I have an idea or a vision of what I'm struggling towards?
Okay. So what is that?
What I'm struggling towards?
Yes.
That actually changes from day to day. Sometimes it's just struggling to get through the day. So I'm struggling towards the couch. No, but actually it's in very broad strokes. It would be a way of living together and organizing life in a way that reduces harm wherever possible. And that is where, for me, feminism also has to take into account other axes of suppression and hierarchy as well. So a feminism that's not anti-racist, that's not anti-capitalist, that's not anti-disableist, and all those isms isn't really worth anything to me.
Do you agree, Samira?
100%, yeah. The whole time that you were speaking, I was thinking, as my definition of feminism keeps growing and keeps getting elaborated, I hope to be able to articulate it as well as you, but I agree 100%, yeah.
So is it right to then have even the linguistic position of feminism in front of your work and artistic practice? Does it come before your art? Does it come, do you have to be, do you think you could make some other type of art, or you would have more freedom as an artist if there wasn't the struggle to fight against first? It's a hard question because there's no A/B testing here. There's no other life you have without those struggles to compare with. But still, one I'd like to address to you, because that's the situation of a male, a cis male. No, I've looked into a talk a few days ago as well, and this man defined white privilege as being coming into a room and having people not assuming who you are just by how you look, right? So how would that be as an artist? How would you think you would feel? How do you imagine you would feel as an artist if you would come onto a stage or into a room without pre-assumptions of who you are, just by how you look?
Wow, I want to write that down and think of a spoken word piece that I can write on that, because I think that's something interesting for me to investigate, because what would we look like if what we said and how we expressed ourselves and what kind of art we created and where we, how do you say this, exposiert?
Exposed, yeah.
Where we exhibited or whatever wasn't, wasn't defined by the presumption of us. That's really, really powerful. So I don't really have an answer, but...
You don't have to have it now. Maybe by the end of our talk, so I'll give you 30 minutes to come up with an answer.
Do you need a pen?
You can borrow a pen or Post-its. I have everything here.
I'm writing it down for you.
Yeah, no, you're a spoken word artist. You can deal with memory and write it down in your head. So yes, I now that I know your definition of it, how do you bring this into your art? How does it come to? Does it have a central place in it, or is it something that you sometimes put aside and just talk about love, for instance?
That's interesting, or a funny fact. I actually have a love poem tonight. But I wanted to circle back to the previous question as well, because I think it relates to this question. So I don't have a defined answer, so I might be rambling a little. But for me, it's a thing, I feel like I have to be, or not I have to be, I choose to be a feminist artist as long as I don't have to be that anymore.
What do you see as a difference? Because I'm assuming I know one, but it may be something different than you mean.
So for me, it feels like I don't really have a choice of whether or not to be a feminist artist, because I am a woman of color in a sexist, racist, classist system. And I deeply believe that there's no innocence, so to speak. So basically everything I say either irritates or reproduces the system. So for example, if I were to bake a cake, I can't just bake a cake. It's an Arab cake or a feminist cake, not even by my own choosing, but by the way the world chooses to look at me. And I think as soon as those things aren't necessary anymore, because we live in a different society, in a more just society, then I will be writing about cakes all the time. Because, well, for me, the art that I do deals with my lived experience. So if I don't experience racism and if I don't experience sexism, or the people and the communities I love and feel close to don't experience these types of oppressions, when that is all over, I don't have to be a feminist artist anymore or an anti-racist artist anymore. But at the same time, on the other hand, I feel like it's very limiting to be always seen as a feminist artist or a woman of color artist, because that's the only space you're allowed to inhabit. So I wouldn't be invited just as a spoken word artist. I would always be invited as a feminist artist, as a woman of color artist. And those are the spaces that I get invited to. And I think it's a privilege to just be an artist.
Mm-hmm. It is. It is. Maybe a white one, then. Let's call it that way. So a few days ago, I don't know if some of you were here. I know some of you were here. There was a question from the audience that I'd like to bring back because there wasn't any time to go further into it. But it was exactly addressing this, that women of color, people of color are invited onto stages sometimes to explain themselves rather to express themselves. When do you feel you will feel, as I'm asking you now to explain yourselves, a difference, but do you feel sometimes it's out of balance? Or how do you experience the difference between explaining that you are not making an Arab cake, that it's not an Arab cake you're making, but it's just a cake made by a woman who is defined as Arab? I don't even know if you really are. So,
I think what has changed for me over the years is who I write for and who I address in my writing. So I do have some pieces that are kind of explanatory because they're kind of addressed towards white people. And I've realized that this is very energy draining because I can do a performance and I haven't stepped off stage for 10 seconds and there's going to be a white man asking me if I wrote myself. Or congratulating me on my English, or, you know, all these, it happened, true stories.
I would like to congratulate you on your patience.
Yes. Well, for a bit of money, I can be pretty patient. Not that patient.
So you were saying as how what's the relation or what's the balance of explaining yourself and expressing yourself, and even when you're expressing yourself, you said that as soon as you get off the stage, you have to start explaining yourself.
Yeah.
Is it because we are still so rare on these stages, or?
I don't necessarily. I think that has to do with it. But at the same time, in Berlin, where I live, the stages that I'm on, usually the audiences are very diverse. The artists are very diverse, and that has a lot to do with who organizes and curates events. So if I know it's a black woman organizing this event, I'm pretty sure that the artists are going to be made up of a diverse group of people and that the audience is not going to be predominantly white. So that's the outside of things, and inside, like I said, I've shifted in who I address, and as soon as I start addressing my communities, I'm still tired when I get off stage, but it's a good tired. It's not an energy draining tired because I don't feel like explaining. I feel like I'm relating.
I will come back to this, but I first like to go to you, Samira, to see if you recognize some of the things that Muna is talking about in her Berlin experience. How is this in Belgium to you, or the parts of Belgium that you cover, or Holland for that matter?
Yeah, this is a question that when I read it, it took me back out of all the questions that you wrote, because obviously my experience as a Muslim plus-size women of color spoken word artist is different in spaces that aren't diverse, and where I know I am being invited to because of what I look like and because of the assumptions or what people think I present, then when I'm performing at spaces that are performed by people of color that I know almost by default people of color will go to, I feel much more comfortable sharing my experiences. I feel much more comfortable being vulnerable because I feel like it's a safe space. I don't feel like things will be taken out of context and used against me or whatever. Whereas if I'm performing in whites-only spaces, well, not whites-only spaces, but spaces that aren't diverse and won't be diverse no matter how hard the people try, that's where I know the price the price that they paid was high enough for me to be there, because people there don't always think of what a safe space is for me, and they think they did the best that they could by putting up a person of color there in their lineup that is mostly male and white, and that's where the effort ends. So just thinking about spaces where, or the difference between explaining myself and just me just being, expressing myself as an artist, there's a huge difference. The place where I can express myself, I'm way more creative. Whereas if I have to explain myself, I kind of close in on myself, and it works counterproductive to my creative process or anything like that.
Am I understanding you both correctly? And also, I'm gonna be honest, I'm drawing from my own experience as well. I'm not gonna hide who I am in this. So I'm relating to what you say. So am I understanding correctly that you define a safe space as a space where you think you are free from microaggressions, where you think microaggressions being questions that deduce you or that just put you in boxes or that offend you or that are straight racists. The absence of the expectation of having to defend yourself is then the definition of a safe space.
I mean, maybe I should say beforehand that apart from doing poetry, I also work as I do a lot of empowerment workshops and a lot of political educational work. And I think I have come to learn over the years that there are no safe spaces. There can only be safer spaces. And to me, a safer space happens at the moment where I can name my experience, where I can share my experience and have it believed and not being questioned. That doesn't mean that I can't be hurt in those spaces, unwillingly, unconsciously. And I don't think that that should be the aim of those spaces, because, you know, we're all human, we're gonna screw up, we're going to hurt people. I think it's really important to find ways how to minimize that and find ways to actively change behaviors that can be hurtful. So, yeah, like I said, for me, a safer space is a space where I can name, share, and be believed.
You're like agreeing.
100%,
yeah, yes.
100%, because I feel like what for me in my particular context is a safe or safer space, which I think is a really good addition to the word, is even when I don't know how to stand up for myself and defend myself in those spaces, I know other people will as well, and I won't be ridiculed. I will be believed. Yeah.
And also, if I can add another thought.
Of course.
I think it's, or why I'm talking about safer spaces is also because I don't want to expect more of my siblings than I expect of white people or people who have privilege over me, because I think that's, it's a violent expectation to expect. I mean, when I do my empowerment workshops, I invite people who have been systematically and structurally traumatized to come into a space and to share their experiences. And I think whenever there's a group coming together that is set up like this with a lot of, you know, personal as well as collective trauma, I can't expect people to be more, know more, be better than I expect people who privilege from those structures of violence. I can hope for people to want to be mindful and to not want to hurt people, but I think it would be a very unfair expectation towards people who I share spaces with. I mean, I'm always living in the hope that people try to be mindful and try to minimize the hurt that they do, but I can't expect them, or I can't put another additional burden on their shoulders that I'm not even expecting from people who are in privilege.
Also, maybe because what I've come to realize is that being a victim of the system that is racism is not something that's secluded to one or the other ethnicity. So we all have to deconstruct and decolonize our own minds, being white or being black or being of color. So there's, I think, no clear expectation there to be had. And then I think in your practices as spoken word artists, there's another layer to the stigma that's added as opposed to written poetry. Do you often experience that too? Because we all know that before poetry was written, it was performed, and it's a way of memorizing, and it even arises as a way of memorizing it better, and somehow it got carried away by all kinds of assumption as to what qualitative poetry would be, and that it would have to be written to be qualitative. So how do you experience that extra in your work?
I experience that, I think, a little less because I don't really perform or perform mainly. I don't really perform in spaces where written poetry gets a place and spoken word poetry, where I can feel that one is praised more and the other is looked down upon more. I do think that sometimes people who have published poetry will be regarded in higher esteem. I don't really know how I feel about that. Mm-hmm. It hasn't set me back in my career, I think, but I do notice that tone. It's been repeated so many times that I do know it. Whereas I feel like I understand that people want to share it and take it with them and make it a part of theirs, but that doesn't mean that that's my aim in my poetry. But in that sense, I have experienced it.
Mm-hmm. But do you feel out of that a pressure to publish?
I don't feel a pressure to publish. No, I don't think I'm in that scene that often that pushes that. I do think that it's like, how do I say this? It's seen as this next step in professionalizing yourself or something. Have you published yet? Can I, it's in people's bios. You see it. Those are the things that make you more important or whatever. It's, have you traveled? Have you performed abroad? Have you published? Have you been published in certain magazines? It's that stuff, because it's what people share before they introduce themselves. It's like, this is what I've done.
I think in my experience in Berlin, those types of art spaces are still way too segregated for me to actually experience anything like that. And I think I do have to mention that I came to spoken word poetry by way of hip-hop, which I think it's really important to mention that you can't have the one without the other in a way. Like, spoken word poetry is hip-hop's older cousin. And I think that is something that gets forgotten a lot of the time. I do think that there's this hierarchy between the written word, the published word, and the spoken word. But at the same time, that's not the hill that I want to die on. It's not the yardstick by which I want to be measured against. I'd much rather try to find out where my points of relation can be. So, for instance, when I learned that in the parts of Arabia that are now known as Saudi Arabia, there were huge poet competitions where people would stand in a circle, in a cipher, as it were, and combat each other in poetry, like have a proper, a cipher. That's something I can relate to. That's a tradition I want to be standing on. Another example to me would be the Quran. It is written, but it's written in rhyming couplets. It's meant to be spoken. It's poetry. So that's another thing. And the third thing for me is that a huge part of the magic of what I experience when I do what I do on stage is that the moment I am in is unique and it's irretrievable after it's passed. It's very similar to improvised theater, where you can have two shows that are exactly the same. And I think that's the magic about it as well. I mean, I would love to be published at some point, but I'd much rather be published. I actually want to write a children's book at some point, and I think I want that to be published rather than my poetry, because it's not the same.
It isn't. I've seen the difference because I did my thesis on movements, poetry movements, as opposed to, well, spoken as opposed to spoken and written. And having come to read and reread poems and then seeing the artist perform, I have come to realize that the understanding is sometimes in the performance. It really, I've read the same poem 50 times, and then I saw the video and immediately understood it. So since then I just know there's no way of fully embodying. There's a Brazilian researcher who gave a really beautiful name to this. It's a three-dimensional aspect of poetry as opposed to the two-dimensional. So the third dimension is also important, as in vision, as in...
And just a last thought on that just came into my head, where I'm just now thinking about whether or not it might be possible that having written poetry be deemed more important, more worthwhile, of a higher quality, might not have to do with the overall body-mind division that's been happening in European thought and philosophy, where that which is on paper totally disembodied from the body that put it on paper is more important and more worthwhile than the body itself that produced it. And I think that's a very problematic way of seeing things, but I think it really ties into this overall European way of dividing the body and mind.
Wow.
I thought you were gonna. I have a numeric division here on paper, and it says, for you who can see it, it says 80-20, and it's something that came to mind when you said some parts of your work and explaining how you go to work. Even you have to mind not being drained before even starting, right? And I read this interview years ago, I think by now, and I've always read it was Chinua Achebe. I don't know if you know the philosopher from Cameroon, who was asked at some point how he perceived the Western perspective on African art, and he responded by saying he didn't. And he said, well, I really don't. I don't think of it. I try not to think of it. And I even made a decision in my head to divide the time where I'm thinking of it and not thinking of it. And that decision is, I will spend most of my time, saying 80% of my time, producing whatever I think is it's worth producing, worth sharing, as if it were some kind of artistic bubble. And then 20% addressing inequalities and also analyzing what people say about my art, because it's also, what you said, is inevitable to be a body of color, a person of color in this world without addressing the inequalities. I think you know this division already. We've talked about this, and do you feel that it's something necessary for your own personal sanity to just make some kind of division in your head as to when are you deconstructing and when are you producing?
Yeah. I remember hearing this and thinking that that's the key, because it wasn't a very conscious decision, but I remember at some point thinking to myself when I was younger even was, I'm not going to invest in dismantling or trying to change people's ideas or thoughts about me and my community, my religion, of people of my background. I'm not going to invest in that. That's honestly a waste of time. It's the debates that you see on TV. It's the endless conversation, the ideas of, in Dutch they say meteen koekjes, bringing tea and cookies to your oppressor or whatever, to try and make him see things from your side, or that's for me was like, I made it a conscious decision to not do that anymore, so when I started writing poetry, something that was so how do I say this, something that I really wanted to express myself about was het hoofddoekenverbod. So how do I say this in English?
Well, the veil was prohibited. The hijab.
Yes. Because I struggled with that.
There are attempts to do it.
Yeah. Because I struggled with that so much in high school, and I really wanted to express myself. And then I figured I don't want to do this because I don't want to tell them why they shouldn't prohibit it. I want to talk to my sisters. I want to talk to people that look like me about our experiences and how traumatic it was and how much power they held over us. I don't want to waste time in telling them that I should be as I am, who I am. No.
At the same time, yes. Mona, please add.
I think you said a lot of super important things there that I can totally relate to. I think one of the big things that racism or sexism or any other power structure does is concentrating our energies on itself. So I don't only understand racism, for example, as a power structure that is violent, but also that diverts attention onto itself. So it diverts my attention from doing anything other than fighting against that. I think it's important to fight against racism, and I want to spend energy on that because I don't have a choice. But at the same time, I think it's much more important to figure out for myself and together with communities that I feel connected to, what do we want instead? And as soon as we come to that question, what do we want instead? A friend of mine who's an Afro-German activist, Kwesi Akins, he once said, what can we do if our only points of connections are our shared experience of suffering? And what better things could we do if we found other points of connection, like diaspora, like decolonization, like envisioning different futures where those parts of our identities are not put up for question or debate anymore. And that's another thing. Paul Gilroy once had this 5-step thing for white people coming to terms with the fact that racism exists, and I'm not super sure about the order of the first 2. I think it's guilt, shame, acknowledgement.
Anger?
No, I think it's guilt, shame, acknowledgement, something, and then reparation. And I've decided, unless I'm paid for it, I don't speak to white people who didn't get over the first 2 steps. Because there's nothing in it for me. And that's another thing. People of color, and especially women of color, black women, are always asked to perform this intellectual and emotional labor for free to educate people on the systems of oppression that they themselves benefit from.
And may I add something to that sentence in a context that predominantly sees itself as liberated and enlightened, which makes the conversation much harder, I think. Because we've come to this assumption that the Enlightenment is some a step that was achieved rather than a work in progress together.
Without even having a critical understanding of what the Enlightenment meant for black people and people of color globally. I mean, Kant is this superhero that I learned about in my philosophy classes. I did my A-levels in philosophy, but never heard about the fact that Kant wrote a racist book about the different races of people. So even the whole idea that the Enlightenment is that big era of figuring out human rights and whatnot, it's the era of defining humans, but only some. So it's the white male who's heterosexual, non-disabled, Christian, and so on and so forth, who counts as human. And that is the ideal of enlightenment that is being transported, but not really mentioned. So I'm super critical of this whole enlightenment idea in the first place. And also coming from a German context, talking about racism gets really hard when the collective understanding is that racism lasted from 1933 to 1945. And there was no racism before because Germany didn't have colonies for that long and not that many either. And there's no racism afterwards because racism becomes equated with Nazism. And Nazism is something that happened to the Germans, not because of the Germans. So talking about racism in Germany is super, super hard because there's this wholehearted belief that there is no racism because racism equals Nazism and nobody wants to be a Nazi.
Do you want to add from your Belgian perspective? I think when it comes to, I don't want to speak in your place, but when it comes to the hijab, it's the equal of this is being people telling you you should be liberated in your place.
Yeah. I was thinking of the Dutch equivalents as well. That people think that they are so enlightened and that they're very proud of themselves for being so integrated and so diverse, but have no problems celebrating Sinterklaas and Black Pete. And exactly in my context here as well, it's the same thing. We're very liberated. Why, after we've liberated you, do you still choose to oppress yourself in such a way? And then feeling that they should take it upon themselves to try and save me still, and if I don't want to listen, set up rules and that followed by institutes that prohibits me from continuing to oppress myself.
Mm-hmm. And just to add on onto that, I mean, what a lot of people don't know or don't want to know, perhaps, is that the idea that, I mean, first off, Muslim women are the only women who have the pressure of liberating themselves outside of their religion, whereas a lot of other women who are religious get afforded the privilege to struggle within their frames of religion. And the other thing is that what a lot of people don't want to know, is that this whole discourse of Muslim women having to be liberated from the hijab was brought to Egypt first and then other countries by white men who were fiercely fighting the growing feminist movements in their English homelands. And all of a sudden, in that connection of women issues and colonial civilizing missions, was this story born that the only way Muslim women could be liberated is if they're liberated from their religion, their society, and their men.
Divide and conquer. Right. I have set an alarm because I knew this would get so interesting, and we're already coming to an end.
Really?
Yes, I don't agree as well. I'm having a real hard time because this is... I had one last question as to how long do you think we'll be talking about this? Because I was talking to Joseph here in the audience the other day, and I said to Joseph, I have let go of the idea that I will see the solution to these questions and problems during my lifetime, and I'm young. I'm really young. But do you agree? Or do you think we really should push to make it go fast? Just like I am doing now.
Like oppression, make it go faster.
Yeah, the whole struggle. Do you think we'll see the effects of decolonization in 50 years, 100 years, aside of what you hope or what you think is right? But as soon as I realized that colonization is a system that was really thoughtfully ingrained in the minds of all people and scientifically pushed onto us and all levels. So this was 500 years of construction, maybe 600, maybe 700. And then we've abolished it. And I think some people, including me at some point, were hoping that 200 years of, okay, we said goodbye to this, it's enough now. But I've ceased to believe it, that there's already over. I'm still deconstructing it. I see you deconstructing it. I see you deconstructing it. So it's not over. How much time still? Because it gave me a lot of peace of mind to think I'm doing my part. I'm doing my piece, but I'm not going to see the end of it. I hope it for my children. I hope so. But
I can totally relate to that. I mean, if I don't completely misunderstand, I think conflict theory teaches us that it takes as long to resolve a conflict as the conflict has been going on. Keeping in mind that the first laws of blood purity were enacted in Spain in the 1500s, that's a pretty long time for a conflict. And I think we're going to have to live with knowing, and I think that's really a relief to know that it's not all on our shoulders, but to know that we're standing in a long line of a tradition of people who have been fighting, because wherever there's oppression, there is resistance.
Luckily, yes.
So for me, it was a big relief to understand I'm standing in a long line of people who have come before me and who will come after me. So all I can do is just do my part and keep on pushing so that in 6, 10, 15 generations to come, there might be some sort of more relief. There might be an overall change, that there might be something that is better than we have now, if we still have our planet by that time. But yeah, it's a huge relief, and it's also... for me, it's an invitation to not only feel connected to people in this space-time, but also to communities in different spaces and different times, because I see all of us connected, and all I can do is pray for a long breath.
Wow.
Beautiful last words. I'm even afraid of making... speaking after this, you know. But we have to open up to our audience and see if there is something that you want to share or ask in the meantime, because we are sharing space-time with you now. Quickly, before forces you into another space-time. Nothing? Really nothing.
We don't bite. Brainstorming doesn't hurt.
Something you didn't agree with? Something you think that's worth more talk? Please, Joseph. There's a microphone coming in, right? Sorry.
Sorry. I appreciate you bringing up hip-hop in terms of your practice, because obviously I would assume you know the history of hip-hop, and it was, I mean, the same reasons that you've laid out for doing what you do is why, like, my predecessors in the city were doing it, and it's so incredible to me to go to other countries and see the impact that hip-hop has had on the oppressed and the voiceless and so on, you know, because back home we really believe it's a cultural institution and one of the purest cultures to have ever existed. So I just want to say thank you for that.
And also, I think we're thematically correct, because one of the 5 pillars of hip-hop is knowledge and sharing it, so something that's little known. But it's what we're doing now, right?
I think to me, there's actually a huge, I mean, all connections or relations that we humans are sense-making machines. So all the connections and the sense we make of everything is at once deeply personal, in my opinion, but at the same time it's a collective thing. And for me, there is a huge, huge and important connection between Islam and hip-hop that is widely overseen, widely understudied, widely not seen at all. I mean, that's another thing a lot of people don't know. The first Muslims in the Americas were enslaved black people and Muslim people who had been deported from Spain. So the Americas would not be what they are without black Muslims being there. And it is within that history and within that lineage and that tradition that hip-hop was born in, at least the way I understand it.
Well, me too. I am from the Americas. I am from Brazil, so I acknowledge too. And even it was a threat. So the black Muslim enslaved people who knew how to write, who were the first to fight the oppressors, were the first threat for the colonizers. So we all have this in common in our bloodline. I have to publicly stop speaking to you, but I will continue as soon as the microphone's off. Thank you for being so numerous again. Please come back tomorrow and afterwards. Continue this talk.
Thank you, Carolina, Samira, and Moon.